It began with a simple mistake, a morning dedicated to the relentless task of tidying their Upper West Side brownstone. Sarah had been folding laundry, dusting antique shelves, each chore a futile attempt to silence the echoing emptiness that had become her life. Michael, her stepson, had returned from college a month prior, bringing with him a whirlwind of youthful chaos. His clothes were draped over every surface. A constant stream of friends flowed through their home, injecting a superficial liveliness, yet Sarah remained a ghost, adrift in her own space. That afternoon, she found herself drawn to Michael's room, a space she intended to reclaim, to impose some semblance of order. Without a second thought, she pushed open the door, a basket of freshly laundered clothes balanced on her hip. But it wasn't Michael she found. It was Ethan. He stood near the window, back to her, shirtless, caught mid-change. The sight stole her breath. Ethan's broad shoulders, the sculpted lines of his back were bathed in the soft afternoon light filtering through the window. A gasp escaped her before she could stifle it. "Whoa!" Ethan exclaimed, whirling around, a t-shirt clutched in his hand, which he quickly pulled over his head. "Oh, Sarah, I am so sorry," she stammered, the laundry basket threatening to slip from her grasp as she spun around to leave. "It's totally fine," he said quickly, his voice tinged with amusement. "Didn't think anyone was home." Sarah paused in the doorway, her cheeks burning. "I should have knocked. I thought Michael was here." Ethan chuckled softly, a warm, familiar sound. "He ran out for pizza. I'm just grabbing my stuff." When she finally dared to glance back, his easy smile disarmed her. He wasn't embarrassed, not like she was. If anything, he seemed almost amused by her flustered reaction. "Well," Sarah said, clearing her throat, "I'll just leave these here." She placed the basket on the edge of the bed and practically fled the room, her heart hammering against her ribs. Ethan had always been a part of their lives. He and Michael had been inseparable since childhood, practically raised in this very house. She remembered watching them race through Central Park, mud-splattered and full of boundless energy, while she sipped coffee and pretended to read on a park bench. But Ethan wasn't a boy anymore. At 25, he'd become someone she barely recognized. Confident, charismatic, with a sharp wit and a quiet intensity that seemed to fill any space he occupied. She hadn't registered the shift until that moment in Michael's room, but now she couldn't seem to stop noticing. Later that evening, as she stood in the kitchen, preparing a simple pasta dinner, Ethan wandered in, leaning casually against the counter. "Hey," he said, his tone light. "Sorry about earlier. Didn't mean to give you a heart attack." Sarah forced a laugh, though the lingering image of his bare shoulders still played in her mind. "No harm done. Just knock next time," she teased, hoping to deflect her own awkwardness. "Fair enough," he said, flashing that easy grin. "So, what smells so amazing?" "Lasagna," Sarah replied, gesturing toward the oven. "You're welcome to stay if you're hungry." "Always hungry," he said with a wink, grabbing a glass of water as he moved around the kitchen. There was a new ease to his presence, a quiet assurance she hadn't observed before. He asked about her day, about the small renovation projects she was tackling around the house, and listened intently as she spoke. It was a simple exchange, yet it left her feeling seen. After dinner, Michael and Ethan retreated to the living room, the sounds of a basketball game and their easy laughter filtering into the kitchen. Sarah lingered, cleaning up, but her focus was fragmented. Her mind kept drifting back to that moment in Michael's room, the way Ethan had looked at her, the casualness of his smile, the way his presence seemed to linger even after he'd left the room. For years, Sarah had been living on autopilot, her days a monotonous cycle of chores and quiet evenings alone since her husband's death. She'd immersed herself in maintaining the house, convincing herself it was enough. But lately, with Michael and Ethan around, the brownstone had started to feel alive again, and for reasons she couldn't quite articulate, Ethan's presence had begun to feel different. That night, in bed, she replayed the day in her mind. She told herself it was nothing, that she was overreacting to a fleeting, awkward moment. But deep down, she knew something had shifted. Ethan wasn't just Michael's friend anymore, and the thought, unsettling as it was, held a strange, forbidden thrill. The following days blurred into a routine of ordinary tasks, yet Sarah couldn't shake the lingering effects of that brief encounter with Ethan. She told herself it was insignificant, a harmless awkwardness that would fade with time. But the more she tried to dismiss it, the more acutely aware she became of him. Ethan's visits to this brownstone grew more frequent, a natural consequence of his friendship with Michael and his new job downtown. He'd drop by for meals, hang out in the living room, occasionally offer to help with minor repairs around the house. Each time he walked through the door, the atmosphere shifted, the energy in the house subtly charged. Sarah found herself torn between wanting to avoid him and secretly longing for his company. One afternoon, while tending to the small rose garden in their Brooklyn backyard, Sarah heard footsteps behind her. "Need a hand?" Ethan's voice was warm, laced with a playful edge. She turned to find him standing a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his easy smile as disarming as ever. "I think I've got it," she replied, brushing a strand of hair from her face, trying to sound nonchalant. "Come on," he said, stepping closer. "You've got dirt all over you. You could use an extra set of hands." Sarah laughed despite herself, handing him the pruning shears. "Fine, but don't butcher them. These roses have been here longer than you have." "Noted," he said, his grin widening as he crouched down beside her. As they worked side by side, the conversation flowed effortlessly. Ethan had always been adept at filling silences, his quick wit and humor keeping things light. But today, there was a different quality to his tone, something quieter, more thoughtful. "You've done an amazing job keeping this place up," he said, gesturing to the garden, the brownstone looming behind them. "Thanks," Sarah said, pausing to wipe her hands on her jeans. "It's a lot of work, but it keeps me busy." Ethan glanced at her, his expression softening. "You do everything around here, don't you?" Sarah shrugged, trying to downplay the implied compliment. "It's just me. Someone has to." "Well, you make it look easy," he said, his voice quieter now. The sincerity in his words caught her off guard, and for a moment she didn't know how to respond. As the afternoon progressed, the conversation shifted to lighter topics. Ethan told her about his new job in finance, the challenges he was facing, the long hours he was putting in. "It's not exactly what I pictured," he admitted, setting the shears down. "But it feels good to be building something on my own, you know?" Sarah nodded, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "It suits you," she said, and she meant it. There was a newfound confidence about him, a quiet determination that hadn't been there before. He smiled, his gaze lingering on hers for just a beat too long. "Thanks, Sarah. That means a lot." Later, as they gathered the clippings and cleaned up, their hands brushed briefly, and a spark, subtle but undeniable, shot through her. She glanced up at him, her breath catching when she saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't overt, but it was there, a flicker of something deeper, something unspoken. "Thanks for the help," Sarah said quickly, stepping back to create some distance. "Anytime," he replied, his tone light, but his gaze steady as he walked back toward the house. Sarah stood there, the shears still in her hand, her heart racing for reasons she couldn't or wouldn't name. That evening, as she prepared dinner, the aroma of garlic and herbs filling the kitchen, Ethan wandered in, drawn by the enticing scents. "Something smells incredible," he said, leaning against the counter. "It's just spaghetti," Sarah said, laughing softly. "If this is just spaghetti, then I'm definitely staying for dinner," he said with a grin. Sarah shook her head, but couldn't help the smile tugging at her lips. "Fine, but you're on dish duty." "Deal," he said, grabbing plates from the cupboard without being asked. As they sat down to eat, Michael joined them, his easy banter filling the room, but Sarah's attention kept drifting to Ethan. The way he laughed, the way he listened intently when she spoke, the way his presence seemed to anchor the space around them. At one point, she caught his gaze across the table, and the warmth in his eyes made her breath hitch. It was subtle, so subtle that no one else would have noticed, but it left her unsettled in the best and worst ways. After dinner, as Ethan washed the dishes and Michael disappeared upstairs, Sarah found herself lingering in the kitchen. "You didn't have to stay and help," she said, leaning against the counter. "I don't mind," he replied, glancing over his shoulder with a smile. For a moment, the only sound was the clinking of plates and the rush of water from the sink. Then, Ethan spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "You don't give yourself enough credit, you know." Sarah frowned, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" "You do so much for everyone," he said, shutting off the water and turning to face her, drying his hands on a dish towel. "But I don't think anyone's taking care of you." The sincerity in his voice left her speechless. She looked away, the weight of his words settling over her. "I'm fine," Sarah said, though the words felt hollow, even to her own ears. "You deserve more than fine, Sarah," he said, his voice steady but soft. When she finally met his gaze, there was something in his eyes that made her chest tighten, an honesty that she wasn't ready to confront. "Good night, Ethan," Sarah said quietly, retreating before she could let herself feel too much. As she lay in bed that night, his words echoed in her mind, "You deserve more than fine." She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear that, how much she needed someone to see her, not as Michael's stepmother or a widow, but simply as a woman. and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder, what if he was right? The next morning, she found Ethan in the backyard again, this time tinkering with the squeaky garden gate that had been driving her crazy for months. He hadn't asked if she needed it fixed. He'd just taken it upon himself, as if sensing the small things she didn't have the energy to manage. I could have called someone to fix that, Sarah said, stepping onto the porch with a mug of coffee in hand. Ethan looked up, sunlight glinting in his eyes. Why call someone when I'm right here? Fair point, Sarah said, smiling despite herself. As he tightened the last screw, she couldn't help but admire how comfortable he seemed, how effortlessly he moved through her life, like he belonged there. Try it now, he said, stepping back and gesturing to the gate. She pushed it open, and for the first time in years, it didn't squeak. Impressive, Sarah said, handing him her coffee as a reward. Glad to help, he replied, taking a sip before leaning casually against the porch railing. They ended up sitting together on the steps, the morning air crisp and quiet. Sarah couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so at ease, just sitting and talking to someone. So what's next on the to-do list? He asked, glancing at her with that easy smile of his. I think the question is, what's next on your to-do list? Sarah countered. Don't you have your own life to worry about? He shrugged, his smile softening. I like being here. It feels good. His words caught her off guard, and for a moment Sarah didn't know how to respond. I appreciate everything you've been doing, she said finally, her voice quieter now. But you don't have to take care of me, Ethan. Maybe I want to, he said, his gaze steady. The simplicity of his statement left her breathless. She felt her defenses begin to crack, the wall she'd built around herself slowly crumbling under the weight of his kindness. They sat in silence for a while, the unspoken tension between them growing thicker with each passing moment. Do you ever think about leaving this place? He asked suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. Sarah glanced at him, startled by the question. Sometimes, she admitted, but it's hard to leave something so full of memories. He nodded, his expression thoughtful. Memories are important, but they're not everything. Sarah stared down at her coffee, his words stirring something deep within her. Maybe not, she said softly, but they're all I've had for so long. That evening, after Michael had gone out to meet friends, Ethan lingered in the living room, flipping through channels on the TV. Sarah found herself standing in the doorway, watching him, her heart heavy with everything she couldn't say. Hey, he said, noticing her, you okay? Yeah, Sarah said quickly, stepping into the room. Just tired. He turned off the TV and sat up, his attention fully on her now. Want to sit? He asked, patting the spot next to him on the couch. Sarah hesitated, but the warmth in his gaze drew her in. She sat down, careful to keep a small distance between them, though the space felt charged, electric. They talked about everything and nothing, their voices low in the quiet of the house. Ethan told her more about his work, his future plans, and the doubts he carried about whether he was on the right path. It's hard, he admitted, feeling like you're supposed to have it all figured out, but you don't. I think that's everyone, Sarah said, her voice soft. I'm twice your age and I still don't have it all figured out. He laughed quietly, his gaze lingering on hers. You seem like you do. I'm a good actress, Sarah replied, smiling faintly. The conversation grew more personal, the walls between them crumbling with every word. Sarah found herself telling him things she hadn't spoken aloud in years, how lonely she'd been since her husband's passing, how she felt like she was just going through the motions of life. Ethan listened intently, his expression soft and full of understanding. You're stronger than you think, he said quietly. Maybe, Sarah said, her voice trembling, but sometimes I don't want to be strong anymore. He reached out then, his hand covering hers. The gesture was simple, but it carried a weight that left her breathless. You don't have to do it all alone, he said, his voice low. Sarah looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that terrified and thrilled her all at once. Ethan, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This isn't a good idea. Why not? He asked gently, his thumb brushing against her hand. Because it's complicated, Sarah said, pulling her hand away, the sudden coldness of the air between them stark. Everything worth having is, he replied, his voice steady. The conviction in his words left her speechless, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the TV in the background. Eventually, Sarah stood, her heart racing. Good night, Ethan, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Good night, Sarah, he replied, his gaze never leaving hers. As she walked upstairs, she felt the weight of his words pressing against her, the quiet promise of something she wasn't sure she could let herself want. In the quiet of her bedroom, she stood by the window, staring out at the darkened city skyline. For so long, she'd convinced herself that her life was over, that she'd had her chance at happiness and lost it. But now, with Ethan's words echoing in her mind, she found herself wondering, what if there was more? The next morning, the brownstone was quieter than usual. Michael had left early for work, and the absence of his usual noise left the space feeling strangely intimate. Sarah found herself in the kitchen, absently wiping down the counters when Ethan wandered in, hair still damp from his shower. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and easy. "Morning," Sarah replied, her gaze flickering to the coffee pot. "Help yourself." He poured a cup and leaned against the counter, watching her with a small smile. "You always this busy?" "It keeps me sane," Sarah said lightly, though she could feel the weight of his gaze on her. "You don't have to do everything, you know," he said softly. The simplicity of his words caught her off guard, and she looked at him, her chest tightening. By mid-morning, they found themselves in the basement, sorting through boxes that hadn't been touched in years. It had started as a casual suggestion, but the task quickly became a shared endeavor, their laughter echoing in the confined space as they unearthed old memories. "Look at this," Ethan said, holding up a faded Polaroid of Michael and himself as kids. They were both covered in mud, their grins wide and unapologetic. "I remember that day," Sarah said, smiling despite herself. "You two tracked dirt through the entire house. Your father was furious." Ethan laughed, setting the photo aside. "We thought we were invincible back then." "You were," Sarah said quietly, the memory tugging at something deep inside her. He looked at her then, his expression softening. "You've always been so good to us, Sarah." The sincerity in his voice left her momentarily breathless. As the hours passed, the task grew lighter, the conversation turning to dreams and aspirations. Ethan told her about the places he wanted to travel, the things he wanted to accomplish, and Sarah listened, captivated by his quiet determination. At one point, she reached for a box at the same time he did, their hands brushing briefly. The contact sent a jolt through her, and she pulled back quickly, her heart racing. "Sorry," Sarah said, her voice unsteady. "Don't be," he replied, his gaze steady. The moment hung between them, charged and heavy, but neither of them moved to break it. Later, as they stood by the workbench, organizing tools, Ethan turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Sarah," he said, his voice quieter now. He hesitated, his hands resting on the edge of the bench. "Do you ever think about more?" The question caught her completely off guard, and she stared at him, unsure how to respond. "More?" she echoed, the word hanging in the air. "With your life," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "What you want, what makes you happy." Sarah swallowed hard, his words cutting through her carefully constructed defenses. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've spent so long just getting through the days, I don't think I've let myself think about it." "You should," he said softly. "You deserve to." The weight of his words lingered long after they'd finished in the basement. That evening, as they sat on the fire escape, the city skyline painted in hues of orange and pink, Sarah found herself replaying the day in her mind. Ethan sat beside her, his presence steady and grounding. "You've done so much for everyone else," he said suddenly. "When do you do something for you?" Sarah glanced at him, startled by the question. "I don't know how to," she said honestly. "Maybe it's time to learn," he replied, his voice low but firm. The conversation shifted something in her, and as the evening wore on, she felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. Ethan's words weren't just a challenge, they were an invitation. By the time Michael came home, Sarah had retreated to the kitchen, needing space to collect herself. But even as she scrubbed the counters and tidied the dishes, she couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath her was shifting. The next day, Ethan and Sarah found themselves working on the living room together, rearranging furniture, patching up a few scuffed walls. The task was simple enough, but every glance, every accidental touch felt magnified, as if the room itself was conspiring to draw them closer. At one point, as Sarah stood on a step stool to hang a picture, she felt the stool wobble beneath her. "Careful," Ethan said, stepping forward to steady it. "I'm fine," Sarah insisted, though the tremor in her voice betrayed her. He placed his hands on her waist to keep her steady, his touch warm and firm. "Let me help," he said, his voice close to her ear. The moment was brief, but it left her breathless. When she stepped down, she turned to thank him, only to find him standing closer than she'd realized. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to fall away. "Sarah," he said softly, his gaze searching hers. "Ethan," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Neither of them moved, the space between them charged with unspoken tension. "I should," she started, but the words caught in her throat. "Should you?" he asked gently, his voice laced with something she couldn't quite name. Sarah didn't know how to respond, so she turned away, retreating to the kitchen under the guise of needing water. That night, as she lay in bed, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. For years, she'd convinced herself that her life was set, that her roles as a widow and stepmother defined her. But now, with Ethan's presence and his quiet insistence that she deserved more, she couldn't help but wonder, what if he was right? The brownstone was quiet that evening, the kind of stillness that amplified every sound, every movement. Michael had left to spend the weekend with friends, and for the first time in days, it was just Sarah and Ethan. She stood in the kitchen, stirring a pot of pasta sauce on the stove, the rhythmic clink of the wooden spoon against the pot the only sound. The air felt heavy, charged with the tension that had been building between them. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, soft but deliberate as he walked into the kitchen. "Smells good," Ethan said, his voice low. "Thanks," Sarah replied, not looking up, afraid her eyes would betray her. "Need any help?" he asked, moving closer, his presence impossible to ignore. "No, I've got it," Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. He lingered near the counter, his gaze on her, and she could feel it like a physical touch. "You always do, don't you?" he said softly. Sarah turned to him then, startled by the weight of his words. "What do you mean?" "You take care of everyone, Sarah," he said, his eyes steady on hers. "But who takes care of you?" The question hung in the air, raw and unanswerable. Sarah felt her chest tighten, a lump forming in her throat. "I don't need—" "Yes, you do," he interrupted gently, stepping closer. The space between them felt impossibly small, and she could feel her resolve weakening under the intensity of his gaze. "Sarah, you don't have to do this alone," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to be everything for everyone, all the time." His words unraveled something inside her, a knot she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Without thinking, Sarah turned off the stove and set the spoon down, her hands trembling. When she finally looked up at him, the vulnerability in his expression mirrored her own. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Because I care about you," he said, his voice steady and certain, "more than I probably should." The honesty in his words left her breathless, and before she could stop herself, she closed the distance between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that was both tentative and desperate. The kiss deepened, years of loneliness and longing spilling into that single moment. His hands rested gently on her waist, as if he were afraid she might pull away, but she didn't. She couldn't. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. "This is crazy," Sarah said, her voice shaky. "Maybe," he replied, his hand still holding her steady, "but it feels right." Sarah searched his eyes, looking for doubt, but there was none, only sincerity and a quiet determination that made her heart ache. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of whispered words and stolen touches. They moved to the living room, the dim light of a table lamp casting a warm glow over the space. They sat close, their knees brushing as they talked, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Ethan told her about his fears, his dreams, the weight of expectations he'd been carrying, and Sarah found herself opening up in ways she hadn't before, sharing parts of herself she'd kept hidden even from those closest to her. "You deserve to be happy, Sarah," he said at one point, his hand covering hers. The simplicity of his statement brought tears to her eyes, and she nodded, unable to find the words to respond. Later, as the night deepened, the atmosphere between them shifted again. Ethan leaned in, his gaze searching hers, and Sarah felt the air leave the room. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, his hand brushing lightly against her cheek. "Yes," Sarah said, the single word carrying more certainty than she'd felt in years. What followed was a slow, deliberate exploration of everything they'd been holding back. His touch was gentle, reverent, as though he were memorizing every detail, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt truly seen, truly cherished. They lay together on the couch afterward, the silence between them filled with unspoken understanding. His arm was draped over her shoulders, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her arm. "You okay?" he asked softly, his voice breaking the quiet. "More than okay," Sarah replied, resting her head against his chest. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, his touch grounding and comforting. "Good," he said simply. The reality of what had happened began to sink in as the night wore on. Sarah knew the path they'd just stepped onto wouldn't be easy. There were questions, complications, and the ever-present fear of what Michael might think if he knew. But for the first time in years, Sarah felt alive, and for now, that was enough. "We'll figure it out," Ethan said, as if reading her thoughts. Together? Sarah asked, her voice tentative. Together, he promised, his grip on her tightening slightly. As the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, Sarah felt a quiet sense of peace settle over her. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of what it might hold. Because with Ethan by her side, she knew they could face whatever came next. The morning after was filled with a quiet stillness. Sunlight streamed through the windows, bathing the living room in a soft golden light. Sarah woke up on the couch, tucked under Ethan's arm, the blanket draped over them like a shield from the outside world. For a moment, she allowed herself to just be, listening to his steady breathing, feeling the warmth of his presence. It was a fragile peace, but it was real. When Ethan stirred, his arm tightened around her for just a second before he opened his eyes. A small, sleepy smile crossed his face, and Sarah couldn't help but return it. "Morning," he said softly, his voice still heavy with sleep. "Morning," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Neither of them moved to get up, as if breaking this moment would bring the weight of reality crashing back down. Eventually, Ethan sat up, his hand brushing lightly over her hair. "How are you feeling?" Sarah hesitated, searching for the right words. "Confused," she admitted, "but happy." His smile widened slightly, and he reached for her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said. "Okay," Sarah said, nodding. "One step at a time." The simplicity of his promise brought a strange sense of comfort. For so long, she'd been afraid to let herself feel, to let herself hope. But now, with Ethan by her side, she was starting to believe that maybe she didn't have to do it all alone. The day passed quietly. Ethan stayed to help her finish a few projects around the brownstone, his presence steady and reassuring. It felt easy, like they'd settled into something unspoken but understood. But as the hours slipped by, the reality of their situation began to creep back in. Michael would be home that evening, and with him came the inevitable questions and complications. Ethan noticed Sarah's tension as they worked in the kitchen, his hand brushing lightly against her arm. "Talk to me," he said gently. Sarah turned to him, her chest tight with worry. "What if this doesn't work? What if we can't—" He cut her off, his voice steady. "We'll figure it out, Sarah. Together." His confidence was unwavering, and though doubt still lingered in her mind, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. That evening, as Ethan prepared to leave, they stood by the front door, the air between them filled with unspoken words. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. He stepped closer, his hands resting lightly on her arms. "I've never been more sure about anything," he said, his gaze steady on hers. The sincerity in his words brought tears to Sarah's eyes, and she nodded, unable to find the words to respond. When Michael arrived home, the brownstone felt quieter, though Ethan's presence still lingered in every corner. Sarah found herself stealing glances at the couch where they'd shared so much the night before, the memories of his touch still fresh in her mind. Michael didn't notice her distraction, too busy recounting stories from his weekend with friends. But Sarah couldn't help wondering how he would react if he knew the truth, if he knew about Ethan and her. The thought terrified her, but it also made her realize something. For the first time in years, she was living for herself. The days that followed were a delicate balance of navigating this new reality. Ethan kept his promise, calling every night and stopping by whenever he could. Each visit felt like a small piece of something bigger, a quiet reassurance that they were building something worth fighting for. There were moments of doubt, moments when the fear of what they were doing threatened to overwhelm her. But every time, Ethan was there, his presence grounding her, reminding her that she didn't have to face this alone. One evening, as they sat on the fire escape, watching the sunset paint the city skyline, Ethan reached for her hand, his touch gentle but firm. "I know this isn't easy," he said quietly. "It's not," Sarah admitted, her voice soft, "but it's worth it." He turned to her then, his expression serious. "You're worth it, Sarah." The weight of his words settled over her, and she felt her chest tighten with emotion. For so long, she'd convinced herself that she didn't deserve this, that her life was meant to be lived in the shadow of loss. But Ethan's words, his presence, made her believe otherwise. As the weeks turned into months, their relationship grew stronger, though they kept it quiet, navigating the delicate balance of their circumstances. The brownstone, once a place of quiet loneliness, had become a space of warmth and renewal. The rooms they'd worked on together felt like symbols of something bigger, something new and full of possibility. One afternoon, as they finished painting the final room, Ethan turned to her, his eyes soft but full of determination. "This house feels different now," he said. "It does," Sarah agreed, smiling as she looked around. That's because of you, he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Tears filled Sarah's eyes, and she reached for his hand, her heart full. No, she said softly. It's because of us. The future was still uncertain, and the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in years, Sarah wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. Because with Ethan by her side, she knew they could face anything together.